something shifted. And it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen quietly. But if you look closely at the pattern, the signs were always there, building slowly beneath the surface until now they're impossible to ignore, because what we're seeing isn't just another headline or another rumor, it's the early outline of something much bigger. A fracture that may already be too deep to repair. For years, the story of Harry and Meghan has been sold as a united front, a battle against institutions, against media pressure, against a system they claimed never understood them. But now a very different narrative is starting to take shape, and this time it isn't coming from tabloids alone, it's coming from someone who has spent decades dissecting powerful figures, someone who doesn't throw words around lightly. And when he says this story is unprecedented, you have to ask yourself, what exactly has he seen that we haven't? Because here's where it starts to get uncomfortable. The upcoming second book, built on years of new material, deeper investigation, and evolving public perception, isn't just revisiting old claims, it's reframing the entire relationship, not as a love story under pressure, but as something far more transactional, far more strategic. And if that sounds harsh, the pattern being described makes it difficult to dismiss outright. Think about it for a moment. When a relationship is built on shared direction, even crisis can strengthen it. But when two people are moving toward completely different futures, the tension doesn't just sit quietly in the background, it grows, it surfaces in subtle ways, in absences, in silence, in moments where one person stands alone when they shouldn't have to. And that's exactly what observers have started noticing. Because while Harry has been front and center through legal battles, public criticism, and increasingly difficult press cycles, Meghan's presence has become selective, almost calculated, and the question that naturally follows is simple, but uncomfortable. Why step back now, at the very moment visibility would matter most? And this is where the story takes a sharper turn. According to the emerging narrative, this isn't random behavior, it's part of a long-established pattern, one that didn't start with Harry. And if that pattern is real, then what we're watching now may not be a rough phase in a marriage, but something far more predictable, almost inevitable. Because the argument being built is clear. Relationships, in this version of events, are not permanent, they are functional, and once that function fades, so does the connection. Now ask yourself something honestly. If that pattern has held true before, what makes this time any different? That question alone is what's driving so much speculation right now, and it's not just about personal dynamics, it's about direction, ambition, and a growing disconnect that may be impossible to bridge. On one side, you have a man who, despite everything that's happened, still appears to be looking backward, still holding on to the idea of reconciliation, still imagining that some version of his past life could be restored, even when every signal from that world suggests otherwise. On the other side, you have a completely different trajectory, one focused not on repairing the past, but on building something entirely new, something bigger, something financially and culturally dominant. A vision that doesn't rely on royal identity, but instead tries to replace it. And here's where the tension becomes impossible to ignore. Because those two paths don't just diverge, they collide. One is rooted in legacy, the other in reinvention. One looks back, the other accelerates forward. And when both exist inside the same marriage, the pressure doesn't stay contained, it spills out into everything. Public appearances, business decisions, media strategy, even silence itself starts to carry meaning. And suddenly, things that once seemed minor begin to look very different. The missed appearances, the lack of visible support during key moments, the increasingly separate professional identities. Are these just coincidences, or are they early signs of something unraveling behind closed doors? Because when you step back and look at the bigger picture, another layer emerges. The projects haven't landed the way they were expected to, the momentum hasn't sustained itself, and in an environment where relevance is everything, where perception drives opportunity, that kind of instability doesn't just affect careers. It affects relationships too. Especially when expectations were set so high from the beginning. And that brings us to the real question at the center of all this, the one that no one is answering directly, but everyone is quietly asking. What happens when the person you built everything around is no longer enough to sustain the future you want? Because if that question has already entered the equation, then what we're witnessing right now isn't just tension, it's transition. And if the past pattern holds, transition doesn't end quietly. It ends decisively. So the question isn't whether pressure exists inside this marriage, that much is already visible. The real question is this: are we watching a difficult chapter, or the beginning of the end? And more importantly, if a decision has already been made behind the scenes, how much of what we're seeing right now is real? And how much of it is simply the slow reveal of something that's already in motion? If you thought the tension was already visible, what comes next makes it far more difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Because now the story isn't just about distance between two people, it's about a pattern that seems to repeat itself with almost unsettling precision, and once you start connecting those dots, the entire narrative begins to feel less like chaos, and more like design. At the center of that pattern is a claim that has followed Meghan Markle for years, and whether you agree with it or not, it keeps resurfacing in different forms, from different sources, across different timelines, and that consistency is what's making people look at the present situation differently. Because the argument being pushed forward again, especially by Tom Bauer, is that Meghan doesn't just enter relationships emotionally, she navigates them strategically, and when you hear that, it sounds harsh at first, almost unfair, until you start examining the sequence of events that people keep pointing back to. Early relationships that faded once career opportunities changed, professional alliances that cooled once their purpose was fulfilled, even media figures who once stood firmly in her corner gradually stepping away when the narrative no longer benefited them, and when you line all of that up, the uncomfortable question becomes impossible to ignore. Is this moment with Prince Harry actually different, or is it simply the highest profile version of the same cycle? Because if it is the same cycle, then what we're witnessing right now isn't random tension, it's timing. And timing, in this context, is everything. Think about where things stand today, not emotionally, but structurally. The initial shockwave of their departure from the royal family has faded. The media dominance that once followed their every move has become less consistent. And perhaps most importantly, the business ventures that were meant to redefine their brand haven't delivered the kind of sustained impact that was expected. Projects launched with massive attention have struggled to maintain momentum. Partnerships that once looked promising have quietly dissolved. And in an industry where perception is currency, that kind of instability doesn't just sit in the background, it starts to influence every decision that follows. And here's where the dynamic becomes even more complicated. Because while those external pressures are building, internally, the direction each of them seems to be taking couldn't be more different. On one side, Harry still appears emotionally tied to the idea of what was lost, still carrying the weight of a past identity that he hasn't fully let go of, still, by many accounts, thinking about reconciliation even when every signal suggests that door is firmly closed. On the other side, Meghan's trajectory looks forward-facing, ambitious, and increasingly independent, focused on building something that doesn't rely on royal connection, but instead attempts to replace it entirely with influence, wealth, and cultural relevance. And here's the question you have to ask yourself. What happens when one person in a marriage is trying to rebuild the past, while the other is trying to outgrow it? Because that's not just a difference in opinion, that's a difference in direction, and direction is what determines whether two people move forward together or slowly drift apart. Now layer something else onto this. The silence. Not the absence of headlines, but the selective absence of presence, the moments where support would normally be visible, expected even. But instead, there's distance, and that distance doesn't scream, it whispers, but over time, those whispers start to add up. Public appearances where Harry stands alone during critical moments, controversies where he absorbs the impact without visible backing, and a noticeable shift in how often they appear as a unified front compared to how they once did. Is that strategic? Or is it symptomatic? Because if you've been watching closely, this isn't happening in isolation. Even their media ecosystem has started to change. Take Omid Scobie, someone who was once deeply aligned with their narrative, almost an extension of their public voice, consistently defending, consistently reinforcing, consistently present whenever their story needed support. And now, he's stepping away. Not just shifting tone, but stepping away from the entire narrative, moving toward fiction, distancing himself from a story he once helped shape. And when someone that closely connected begins to exit the frame, you have to ask, what changed behind the scenes that made staying no longer worth it? Because people don't walk away from proximity to power without a reason. And when you combine that with everything else, the shifting priorities, the diverging goals, the inconsistent public presence, the picture that starts to form isn't one of stability, it's one of transition. A transition that may already be further along than anyone is willing to admit publicly. And here's where it becomes impossible to ignore the bigger implication. If Meghan's long-term goal is what some claim it is, a billion-dollar brand, a level of influence that stands independently of any royal association, then every relationship, every decision, every move would ultimately be measured against one thing. Does it still serve that goal? And if the answer to that question starts to become unclear, or worse, starts to become no, then what happens next isn't emotional, it's strategic. So now the question shifts again, and this one is even more direct. If the value equation inside this marriage is changing, are we watching two people fight to hold it together? Or one person quietly preparing to move on? Because if preparation has already begun, it wouldn't look dramatic at first. It would look exactly like this. Subtle distance, selective appearances, gradual separation of identity, and a narrative that slowly conditions the world for what comes next. So let me ask you this. If the signs are already this visible, what do you think is happening behind the scenes that we haven't seen yet? And more importantly, how close are we to the moment where it's no longer speculation, but confirmation? And if you thought the story couldn't get more revealing, this is where it starts to feel less like a theory and more like a slow, deliberate unraveling. Because once you shift your focus from personal dynamics to public outcomes, a very different kind of evidence begins to emerge. The kind that doesn't rely on opinion, but on results. Because at the end of the day, narratives can be defended, interviews can be managed, and public appearances can be carefully controlled, but outcomes are much harder to disguise. And right now, the outcomes are raising serious questions. Look at the trajectory over the past few years, not in headlines, but in execution. Major deals that once carried enormous expectations have struggled to produce consistent success. Projects that launched with global attention have quietly faded without long-term impact. And in an environment where momentum is everything, that kind of inconsistency doesn't just slow progress, it creates pressure. Pressure that doesn't stay confined to business. It seeps into identity, into decision-making, and ultimately, into relationships. Because when the vision was first introduced, it was bold, almost revolutionary. The idea that they could step away from the royal system and build something even bigger on their own terms, something modern, influential, and financially dominant. But here's the uncomfortable reality. That kind of transformation doesn't just require ambition, it requires alignment, discipline, and most importantly, patience. And this is exactly where respected voices like Tina Brown have started to raise concerns, not from a place of hostility, but from observation, pointing out that the approach has often felt rushed, reactive, almost as if the next move is being chosen before the current one has had time to succeed. Now ask yourself something critical. What happens when someone is chasing a long-term empire with short-term impatience? Because that gap between expectation and reality can become dangerous, especially when the pressure to succeed is constant and highly visible. And when that pressure builds, it forces decisions. Decisions about direction, decisions about strategy, and sometimes decisions about people. Because if the original formula isn't delivering the expected results, then naturally, the question becomes, what needs to change? Is it the strategy? Is it the execution? Or is it the structure of the partnership itself? And this is where the spotlight quietly shifts back onto Harry. Because if you listen closely to the analysis being built, one detail keeps coming up again and again, and it's surprisingly simple but incredibly significant. Harry is not built for the world Meghan is trying to dominate. Not because he lacks intelligence or capability, but because his entire life has been shaped in a completely different environment. One where financial survival was never a concern, where structure was provided, where identity was inherited rather than constructed. And now, suddenly, he's operating in a space that demands constant reinvention, relentless competition, and an almost instinctive understanding of branding, monetization, and influence. That's not just a career shift. That's a complete psychological shift. And according to voices like Tom Bauer, that disconnect is at the heart of the problem. Because while Meghan is pushing toward a future defined by wealth, status, and independence, Harry is still navigating a world he was never prepared for, and more importantly, may not even fully understand. And when two people are operating on completely different wavelengths like that, the strain doesn't need to be dramatic to be real, it just needs to be constant. Now layer in something else that's been quietly shaping perception. The contrast. Because while this internal uncertainty continues to grow, back in the UK, Prince William has been stepping further into his role, handling high-level responsibilities, representing the monarchy on the global stage, and doing so with a level of consistency that reinforces stability. And whether it's fair or not, that contrast is being noticed. Every time William appears composed in moments of significance, it sharpens the perception of what Harry walked away from, and more importantly, what he hasn't been able to recreate. And perception, especially at that level, is powerful. Because it doesn't just influence public opinion, it influences opportunity, credibility, and long-term positioning. So now the gap becomes even wider. On one side, a structured path that continues to strengthen over time. On the other, a constantly shifting strategy still searching for its breakthrough. And in the middle of that gap, a marriage trying to hold two completely different realities together. So let me ask you something that cuts right to the core of this entire situation. If one person in that marriage begins to believe that the partnership itself is limiting the future they're trying to build, how long does that partnership realistically survive? Because at that point, it's no longer about love or loyalty or even public image. It becomes about alignment. And when alignment disappears, everything else starts to follow. Which brings us to a moment that might seem small on the surface, but carries a much bigger implication underneath. The growing independence in branding. The subtle shift toward individual identity over shared identity. The idea that one name can stand without the other. Because once that transition is complete, once the audience no longer sees you as a unit but as two separate forces, the final step doesn't feel sudden anymore. It feels expected. And that's what makes this phase so critical. Because we're not looking at a dramatic collapse. We're looking at a gradual separation that becomes clearer with every passing month. So now the question becomes even more direct. Is this marriage under pressure because of external challenges? Or are those external challenges simply revealing a deeper truth that was always there? And if that truth is finally surfacing, then maybe the real story isn't about whether something is going to break. It's about whether it already has, and we're just watching the final stages play out in slow motion. And if you're starting to feel like everything is slowly pointing in the same direction, this is where the story becomes impossible to ignore, because now we're no longer just looking at patterns or pressure, we're looking at behavior that feels deliberate, almost as if the next phase isn't being forced, but carefully prepared. Because when a major shift is coming, especially at this level, it rarely arrives as a shock. It arrives in stages, subtle at first, then increasingly visible, until one day the announcement simply confirms what the audience has already been conditioned to accept. And that conditioning may already be underway. Look at the way the public narrative has been evolving, not through direct statements, but through tone, through positioning, through what is and isn't being emphasized, and one detail stands out more than anything else: the gradual repositioning of identity. Not we, but she. Because over time, the focus has been shifting away from the couple as a unified force and toward Meghan Markle as an individual brand, an independent figure, someone whose trajectory doesn't necessarily require a shared platform anymore. And once that shift begins, it's very difficult to reverse. Because independence, once established in the public mind, changes expectations. It changes how audiences interpret appearances, how they read absence, how they understand silence, and suddenly, moments that once felt normal start to feel intentional. Like when one partner faces public pressure alone. Like when joint appearances become less frequent. Like when messaging starts to feel separate. Now, none of this confirms anything on its own, but when you place it alongside everything else, the diverging goals, the inconsistent outcomes, the shifting alliances, it starts to look less like coincidence and more like alignment toward a new reality. And this is exactly the kind of transition that Tom Bauer appears to be building toward in his upcoming work. Because what he's suggesting isn't just that the marriage is under strain, but that the strain itself is a symptom of something larger, a structural mismatch that may have been there from the very beginning. A mismatch between ambition and identity, between reinvention and legacy, between a future that demands complete independence and a past that refuses to fully let go. And here's where things take a sharper, more strategic turn. Because if you believe that narrative, then the next step wouldn't be emotional, it would be calculated. It would involve timing, positioning, and most importantly, control of the story. Because in a situation like this, whoever defines the narrative first doesn't just tell the story, they shape how the world understands it. And that's where the silence becomes even more interesting. Because silence, in moments like these, isn't always absence. Sometimes, it's preparation. Preparation for a shift that needs to be introduced carefully, framed correctly, and delivered at the exact moment it will have the maximum impact. And if that's the case, then what we're seeing right now, the distance, the selective presence, the growing individual focus, may not be random at all. It may be the setup. Now think about what typically happens next in situations like this. The groundwork is laid quietly. Public perception is gradually adjusted. And then, when the moment finally comes, it feels less like a shock and more like a confirmation of what people already suspected. Because the audience has already been guided there. So let me ask you something that cuts deeper than anything we've discussed so far. If the narrative is already being shaped, if the audience is already being prepared, then is the real decision still ahead of us? Or has it already been made behind closed doors? Because if it has, then everything we're seeing right now takes on a completely different meaning. The absence isn't distance. It's positioning. The silence isn't uncertainty. It's control. And the gradual separation we're witnessing isn't the beginning of something breaking. It's the final stage of something that has already been decided. And that leads to one final, unavoidable question. When the moment comes, when whatever is being prepared finally becomes public, will it feel like a sudden collapse? Or will it feel like something you saw coming all along? And if everything we've just walked through feels like it's building towards something unavoidable, that's because this is the point where speculation stops feeling like guesswork and starts feeling like a countdown, because when patterns, pressure, and positioning all begin to align, the outcome rarely surprises anyone. It simply arrives. Because think about where we are right now. A relationship that once thrived on visibility is now defined by selective presence. A shared identity that once dominated headlines is slowly being replaced by individual positioning. A long list of high-profile ambitions has struggled to translate into consistent results, and in a world driven by momentum, that kind of instability forces decisions whether anyone is ready for them or not. And right at the center of all of it, two completely different visions of the future continue to pull in opposite directions. On one side, Prince Harry, still emotionally tied to a past that no longer exists in the way he remembers it, still navigating a space that was never built for him, still, by many accounts, hoping that something broken might one day be repaired. On the other side, Meghan Markle, moving forward with a level of focus that doesn't look backward, chasing something bigger, something independent, something that doesn't rely on the very institution they once stepped away from. And here's the reality that sits between those two paths. They don't meet anymore. They don't even run parallel. They diverge. And when that divergence reaches a certain point, the relationship doesn't collapse overnight. It simply reaches a moment where continuing as it is becomes harder than changing entirely. That's the moment everything hinges on. And according to the narrative being shaped by voices like Tom Bauer, that moment may not be far away at all. Because if you look at the trajectory, not just emotionally, but strategically, everything points toward a transition that has already begun behind the scenes. The subtle distancing, the controlled appearances, the gradual shift from we to I. The quiet exit of allies like Omid Scobie, who were once deeply embedded in their narrative. Each of these on its own might not mean much, but together, they form something far more telling. A setup. And setups only exist when something is about to follow. So now the question isn't whether pressure exists, or whether differences are real, or even whether the marriage is under strain. The real question is this. What happens when the next move is no longer about saving what exists, but about securing what comes after? Because if that shift has already taken place internally, then the public moment, whenever it arrives, won't be about emotion. It will be about timing, about narrative control, about stepping into the next chapter in a way that feels inevitable rather than abrupt. And that's what makes this story so compelling right now. We're not watching a sudden collapse. We're watching a slow reveal. A reveal that's been building through silence, through absence, through subtle signals that only start to make sense when you step back and look at the whole picture. So let me leave you with this, because it's the question that sits at the center of everything we've explored. If all the signs are already in place, if the narrative is already being shaped, if the distance is already visible, then how much of this story has already happened behind closed doors? And when the truth finally surfaces, when whatever is being prepared becomes public, will it change what you think about this relationship? Or will it simply confirm what you've been seeing all along? Because sometimes, the biggest stories aren't the ones that shock you. They're the ones that unfold right in front of you. Until one day, there's nothing left to reveal. If you've made it this far, you already see how deep this goes. And I'm curious. Do you think this is just another phase? Or are we witnessing the final turning point of a story that was always heading here?